Hello, students of MACS 230, the Canadian Cultural Industries in Mass Media course, available through the SCMS department at the University of the Fraser Valley. And welcome to our 11th lecture in our ongoing exploration of these cultural industries. Today, we will be continuing our look at the Canadian movie industry, a continuation of Lecture 10 from last class, but we will be moving past its earliest years, past the Canadian Cooperation Project that we looked at quite extensively in the last lecture, and into the era of the Renaissance in the 1960s through to the new millennium of cinema production in Canada. As always, along with this video presentation, in lieu of face-to-face instruction in the present circumstances we find ourselves in, I have uploaded to the weekly course material of the Blackboard LMS, where you found the link to this video, an accompanying PowerPoint presentation. And I will, as always, verbally cue when it's appropriate to switch to the next slide in the presentation, as well as embedding images from the PowerPoint presentation right into this video lecture. So at this point, I'll invite you to advance to the second slide in the PowerPoint presentation that goes along with this video lecture. And I think it might be useful to just do at least a brief review of the early history of Canadian cinema that we looked at last class, just to give some context to where we'll pick up at the end of the Canadian Cooperation Project with the lecture for this class. So as we know, cinema was invented around the turn of the 20th century, around 1900. And at the time of the earliest cinema production by the Lumiere brothers and Thomas Edison, at the end of the 19th century, the first public screening of a film in Canada took place on June 28th in 1896, of course in Montreal, where so many Canadian cultural industries found their birth. In July of that year, Andrew and George Holland of Ottawa introduced Edison's Vitascope to the Canadian public in Ottawa's West End Park. And among the scenes shown, as we looked at last class, was The Kiss, starring May Irwin, a Broadway actress from Whitby, Ontario, as it happens. And in 1911, Ontario established the first board of censors in North America, which I didn't mention last class, but interestingly, it actually banned the excessive display of the American flag as a response to the United States' failure to join the war effort in Europe until 1917. And interestingly, Manitoba passed an act that delegated film censorship to the city of Winnipeg. British Columbia, Alberta, and Quebec established active censor boards in 1913, and Manitoba founded a proper provincial board in 1916. And again, as we discussed last class, the Ontario Motion Picture Bureau, the OMPB, was the first in the world state-sponsored film organization, founded by the Government of Ontario in 1917. And around the First World War, which went from 1914 to 1918 historically, Canada saw the first widely released Canadian newsreels. And feature film production expanded in Canada. Of course, expanded is a relative term, considering one or two films was the best being produced per year in these early decades of the 20th century. And also around the First World War, the Canadian-owned Allen Theatres chain and associated distribution companies expanded across the country. When the Allen Theatre chain, when their imminent success became apparent, Paramount Studios' Adolph Zucker tried to buy them out, actually. But the Allens, they refused. And in doing so, Zucker actually withdrew the Pickford films that had made such success from the Allen Theatre chain. He wouldn't let them use these successful films anymore, and the Allen brothers were actually driven out of business by this. By 1923, the Allen Theatres chain from across the country was gone, leaving a near monopoly in Canada in the hands of Paramount and Famous Players Canadian Corporation. And you'll also remember from last class an early success, actually, in Canadian cinema production was Nell Shipman's Back to God's Country from 1919. It was produced in Calgary, and unlike so many Canadian films, it actually returned a profit to its Calgary backers of 300% of production costs. And it also includes, as we discussed last class, Nell Shipman's groundbreaking nude appearance in the movie, which was little more than her under a waterfall. Nothing particularly titillating. Yet it did cause quite a stir, quite a Hollywood and cinematic in general scandal that probably improved that 300% backing. In 1922, the Canadian Motion Picture Distributors Association, the CMPDA, was formed at the same time, actually, that the Hollywood majors were securing their vertically integrated business model. And although the CMPDA was Canadian in name, the association consisted of the Canadian offices, really, of the major American distribution companies, and was, in essence, a branch of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association of America. In fact, for the purposes of calculating domestic gross revenue, as we discussed, American distributors began including Canada in their bottom line. The next era that we looked at, often referred to in Canadian cinema history as the Dirty 30s, refers to the British quota era, which manifested Canadian quota quickies. So in 1927, the UK instigated its Cinematographic Film Act, which was an effort to protect and foster the domestic industry against dominating American imports. It was a quota for a minimum number of domestically produced films to be exhibited in domestic theaters. And yet the quota included films that were shot in the British Dominions, such as Canada and Australia, which then resulted in 1928, as I said, in the production of a number of Canadian quota quickies. Now, the quota quickies were really B films, an effort by Hollywood interests to circumvent the quota by filming in Canadian locations, especially in British Columbia. However, by 1938, at least a full decade later, the Cinematographic Films Act excluded Canadian production from the quota, largely because of the recognition that the Hollywood interests were undermining it, and the quota quickies era came to an abrupt end. We then proceeded to look at the era of the NFB, the National Film Board of Canada, which was initiated in Canada in 1939, following a survey of the industry by a Scottish documentary filmmaker named John Grierson, who was then installed in 1939 by the Canadian government as the head of the NFB. And the early NFB films really had a lot to do with very socialist concerns, ironic considering the nature of the Second World War that started in the same year that the NFB was initiated. And there was much out of the NFB over the 2 or 3 or 4 decades that followed experimental film. We look particularly at the avant-garde animation films of Norman McLaren, particularly his Oscar-winning Neighbors from 1952, right on through to the more apocalyptic Squiggle Vision animation film The Big Snit in 1985. And we concluded our lecture last class with a discussion of the Canadian Cooperation Project, which lasted between 1948 and 1958. And this effectively installed a near 20-year moratorium on Canadian narrative cinema production, on feature-length narrative cinema production. And really the agreement fundamentally was made by the Canadian government with Hollywood interests that Canada would not produce narrative cinema in exchange for the product placement of Canadian tourism in as many Hollywood films as possible. And what this did was not only shut down significant feature film narrative cinema production in Canada, but it also put Canada significantly behind in terms of technological innovation and just general cinematic know-how for the production of such films. And it would actually take decades for Canada to catch up with its know-how and its technological industrial resources available to cinema production. So at this point, it's appropriate to proceed to the third slide in the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this video lecture. Of course, more recently, the Canadian theatrical film industry remains relatively small. The long-standing footprint of the Canadian Cooperation Project, generating only $351 million per year in spending. That was in 2012-2013. And producing, in that same year, 93 feature films, 59 in English and 34 in French. The average budget in 2012-13 for an English language features was 4.6 million Canadian dollars and 3 million Canadian dollars for French language features. And of course, most of this cinema production took place in Ontario and Quebec, although certainly British Columbia boasts its own significant cinema industry, although it might be more a branch plant of Hollywood interests than a nationalist cinema industry in its own right. And really, when people look at the economics of any cinema industry, any national cinema industry, it's really broken down into three sectors: production, distribution, and exhibition. So the production of a film, the distribution of a film to different theaters, and then the exhibition side of that when the film is shown at any given theater. In Canada, the government's principal policy contributions have actually come in the production sector of the film industry, rather than in either of the distribution or exhibition ends. And of course, this has had significant consequences to the widespread popularity and expansion of the Canadian film industry. Throughout its history, the Canadian film industry has faced two significant problems that are actually quite unique to the Canadian media industry in general. We've talked about these in previous classes. And these two problems are, first of all, the struggle against the entertainment monopoly of Hollywood. Keeping in mind, Canada not only has a contiguous border with the United States, but it shares a first language of English outside of pretty much only Quebec. And so this dominant and powerful product coming out of Hollywood certainly has significant popularity in Canada, a behemoth industry against which lesser funded Canadian filmmakers need to compete. And of course, we've talked about in previous classes the economies of scale, which actually make American media products less expensive to producers and distributors in Canada than its homegrown cinema products. And the second major problem is the search for an audience for Canadian film that remains largely unaware of its own domestic industry. In fact, there's an old joke that suggests the defining characteristic of Canadian film is that Canadians have never seen any of it, which is somewhat untrue, but generally they're unaware of which films are Canadian that they have seen. A celebrated Canadian film scholar named William Beard, he uses the somewhat odd metaphor of a wrestling match between Hollywood and the Canadian film industry for the prize, he calls it, of the Canadian box office. And he suggests that Hollywood, outweighing its Canadian counterpart by 200 pounds, hit Canadian movies over the head with a folding chair in round one and has been sitting on their neck ever since. If a Canadian government referee ever objects to this behavior, Hollywood's tag team partners, the MPAA and the State Department, they climb over the ropes and throw him into the crowd, who see nothing to object in the spectacle. The major distributors in Canada, Beard concludes, will not carry Canadian product, and the major exhibitors will not show it even if they do. Statistically, the percentage of English Canadian films on domestic screens hovers somewhere between 1% and 2%, in contrast to Quebec's average for the past decade of better than 15 and closing in on 20%. And of course, this has to do with the fact that Quebec's domestic film industry, largely in French, is not competing so directly with the American film industry's English-made product. And government efforts have been made to legislate some kind of access to the Canadian marketplace by Canadian films, but these quotas, as we discussed last class, historically have generally just fizzled out or not been implemented. They were sort of suggested to the American interests, who had no financial motivation under the conditions of capitalism to bother with these quotas. And then the last phase that I want to introduce here, looking through the new material for this course. The last, section of this slide, it's not a phase, we've just been sort of discussing theory, it begins immediately following the Canadian Cooperation Project. Remember, that ran from 48 to 58. And in the 1960s and 1970s, there was what's come to be called the Renaissance in Canadian feature film cinema production. Of course, as I said before, Canadian cinema producers were a little bit behind their American interests, having been in moratorium for effectively 15 years, and the uptake was slow. Interestingly, the first Canadian film to enjoy widespread distribution in the United States was a 3D potboiler called the MACS. You can see an image of the promotional media fair for that here. It was released in 1961, and certainly there are clips from this available on YouTube. Unlike the films that are considered those that rejuvenated the Canadian film industry, it was, like I said, a potboiler, 3D, sort of a fantasy melodrama. But other films of the era, including Nobody Waved Goodbye from 1964, that was originally an NFB production intended to be a documentary that sort of morphed into a narrative film as it was produced. A contribution from Quebec called Mon Oncle Antoine from 1971, frequently considered the best Canadian film ever made. And another one by Canadian film director Don Shabib from 1970 called Going Down the Road, which are the three I've pictured here. There's many, many more that were part of this Renaissance. These might be the most significant and the largest returns that the Canadian industry enjoyed. Now, what was typical about these last two, Nobody Waved Goodbye, Mon Oncle Antoine, these last three, Nobody Waved Goodbye, Mon Oncle Antoine, and Going Down the Road, what came to be referred to as classical Canadian social realism. They were relatively experimental in their aesthetics, certainly not following the conventions of classical Hollywood cinema. Oftentimes, the fact that they were films was foregrounded rather than being hidden in some sort of narrative transportation. And the aesthetics of the film, by Hollywood standards, was certainly quite unsophisticated. And so at this point, these films invite us to explore the particular characteristics of at least English Canadian cinema. And so I'll invite you now to proceed to slide number 4 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation for this video lecture. So in the nationalist scholarship of the 70s and 80s, that was significantly concerned with defining what English Canadian cinema is rather than looking at its cultural work per se, there was a number of works that made an effort to sort of categorize the characteristics of Canadian cinema. And so I've derived this list here. It's taken from a variety of sources, but primarily from Robert Fothergill's somewhat infamous paper entitled Being Canadian Means Always Having to Say You're Sorry, The Dream Life of a Younger Brother from 1974, which was then later renamed. I'll come to that later on. And this younger brother metaphor obviously refers to the Canadian film industry in its relationship to the American film industry. And of these sources, of which Fothergill's is primary, the typical aesthetic markers of a film's traditional Canadianness include stark, if not depressing, social realism, a documentary flavor, eccentric and offbeat characterizations, and contemplative treatment of the landscape, according to Canadian film scholar Christine Ramsey. And these were generally presented in a dull Canuck-o vision, is what it came to be called, which is a vague but somehow obvious symptom of low budgets and less technical experience with the forms established as a norm by Hollywood. These were these grainy, darkly lit, almost naive conventional productions that came to be characteristic of Canadian cinema. And these characteristics that you see listed in the slide here have remained astonishingly abiding even into the rise of the new wave of cinema in the 80s and 90s and into the new millennium populism of co-production like Resident Evil, for example. And just to sort of adumbrate this list, the first item is elliptical narratives, which refers to sort of interconnected narrative strands. Rather than having one major character, there might be several major characters, and their stories will be connected and disconnected in strange ways. There are time slides, sometimes significant. But what there is not generally in these early Canadian films was a linear narrative that had sort of a beginning and an end following a single, often male protagonist through his conflict and resolution. And a result of this is the second characteristic, narrative aperture rather than closure. There's no neat and tidy tying up of loose ends in both the plot and subplots. Rather, there's a lack of resolution in these films, a feeling of unresolved open-endedness to which the viewer is intended to react interrogatively. And the next item on this list I've listed as smart films, which is taken from a number of texts referring to a theorist defining films that are actually unpopular in the United States. And what this means is that typically these Canadian films required more intellectual investment than Hollywood cinema generally did. The narrative connections are not made as explicit as with Hollywood realism, which has these very clear linear narratives and really obvious character development. And this was also part of what is defined as a postmodern irony. And this, in its simplest articulation, refers to sort of the destabilizing of our understanding of the content of a film as either critical or reproductive of cultural normativity. And another thing that these early Canadian films did, and continue to do in many ways, is they shattered the myth of upward mobility. They shattered the myth of the American dream. The Hollywood cinema was deeply concerned with creating this mythology of, hard work and success and America as the land of opportunity. And the Canadian films were far more bleak. Happy endings were rare when they occurred at all. For example, Going Down the Road shows two young men from the Maritimes, disenfranchised in their labor, believing that traveling to the urban center of Toronto will provide them with opportunities and wealth unforeseen in their lives, only to be absolutely disappointed that their skill set is not consonant with the jobs that are available for them in Toronto. And eventually they leave the city pursued by police for a violent theft, broken and disenfranchised. And there are myriad examples of Canadian cinema. Canadian cinema is busy with anxiety dreams of failure and defeat. And even in Highway 61, which is a Toronto New Wave film that I'll discuss a little bit later in this video lecture, it parodies the American dream, even parodies the Canadian reversal of the American dream in these early films. And the next item on this list of characteristics that you can see on the accompanying PowerPoint slide, which I've already mentioned, is a version of social realism related to the documentary tradition. If, according to Fothergill, if aside from their relative quality as art or entertainment, the films don't attract the public, it may be because the dream is not an alien one, but only too familiar. That is to say that a lot of these films frequently trade on the conventions of documentary film rather than Hollywood cinema, at least the conventions of documentary that were contemporary, which were often black and white, very realist. The scripts were superseded with the sort of ad-lib performances of actors many, many times, and they dealt with problems in society rather than fantasies of success and delusions of grandeur. And the next item on the list, you'll note, is bleak, often wintry landscapes. And of course, this tradition dates right back to the earliest films in Canadian cinema history. Certainly, they were featured significantly in Nell Shipman's Back to God's Country. And this characteristic is often related to a book published in 1972 by celebrated Canadian author Margaret Atwood named Survival. And in Atwood's book, her contention is that the Canadian national identity rests on a preoccupation with survival, both personal and cultural survival. And often this survival is a necessity in the context of bleak, wintry Canadian landscapes that are often unforgiving to the individual. And the last item on this list is certainly not least. It's actually quite significant, a tradition that also maintains largely into more recent Canadian film production. And this is the idea of highly inadequate males contrasted against much more upstanding women characters in the films. A dominant feature in these films is the representation of the leading male characters as radically inadequate human beings, especially and most visibly in their relationship with women. In these films, for a man, identification means involving oneself in the experience of impotence. And for a woman, it means sharing the discouragement which that impotence engenders. A male protagonist in these films is often shallow and even contemptible, whereas the women in whose eyes this exposure takes place, oftentimes the point of view, the perspective in these films is actually from the female protagonist's perspective. It's privileged. And this, the eyes of the women, this shallow, contemptible male, that's where these men are endowed with integrity and generosity, only through the generosity of the characterization of the female characters in the film. And there are very few of the sort of monstrous and vilified representations of women, or at least passive in the service of the male heroes representation that were typical of American cinema. Very, very different conventions for the gender characterization of both men and women in these Renaissance Canadian films. And at this point, to talk more about these unfortunate characterizations of men, these underdog men, perhaps a symptom of the Canadian film industry's relationship with the domination of American or of Hollywood particular interests, I'll ask you to proceed now to slide number 5 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this video lecture. So, building on these aforementioned characteristics of Canadian film, especially the weak male characters against the more upstanding female characters. Robert Fothergill's article, which I mentioned was originally entitled "Being Canadian Means Always Having to Say You're Sorry," was actually famously renamed based on his analysis of these male characters into Coward, Bully, or Clown, it came to be called. And Fothergill claims that the characteristics of English Canadian cinema are based on a quote-unquote little brother complex of colonial identity and American superiority. And these two, colonial identity and American superiority, have been famously articulated by Northrop Frye, echoed by many, in which Canada is characterized as a country that's doubly colonized. It's colonized by its British colonial roots, as well as by an invasive American media dominance. And Fothergill states that, quote, aware of his more powerful brother as a feature in the landscape, in a way that has never been reciprocated, the younger brother has grown up with a painfully confined sense of his own capacity for self-realization, an abiding sense of himself as inescapably diminished, secondary, immature, has become second nature, has indeed shaped his nature and bred into a self-thwarting knowledge of personal inadequacy. a somewhat scathing indictment of the egos that populate Canadian cinema production at this time of Renaissance. And our own textbook, on page 97 of the chapter that's appropriate for this lecture, it says that Vivian and Morin state that in 1976, celebrated Canadian film scholar Peter Harcourt argued that Canadian movie scripts symbolically reflect our own social uncertainties, both our uncertainty of action as a nation and our own present lack of security in dealing with ethnic and cultural problems which throughout our vast nation, through which we're trying to define ourselves. And so Vivian and Morin go on to point out in the same chapter that in her history of Canadian film, entitled Weird Sex and Snowshoes, Canadian film journalist Catherine Monk offers a somewhat updated Canadian checklist of themes in Canadian movies. And these include the following variations of uncertainty that Peter Harcourt introduced in 1976, and that are not really all that different from the list we've already looked at in the previous slide. But they include identity issues, being an outsider, empty landscapes, internal demons, personal alienation, language barriers, being on a road to nowhere, questions of faith, survival guilt, and ambiguous endings. And if you're carefully comparing, you can certainly see echoes, if not direct correspondences, to the list of characteristics that emerged much earlier than Monk's book, from the previous slide that we looked at, adumbrating these characteristics of Canadian cinema in general. So at this point, I'll invite you to advance to slide number 6 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this lecture video. And we'll move into a discussion of what's called the capital cost allowance era, or more succinctly, the tax shelter era, that went generally from 1974 to 1982. So in 1974, the Canadian federal government increased the capital cost allowance for the production of a film from 60% to 100%, as long as the film qualified as Canadian. So like I had said before, rather than doing anything really to sponsor and support the exhibition side of the three pillars of Canadian film production, this was a production side incentive. And the problems of distribution and exhibition, which were really at the heart of the unpopularity of Canadian cinema, were ignored. These films had no audience, and this production side capital cost allowance, it was a tax deduction, really bolstered production, but all that happened as a result was that we had more films that nobody would distribute or exhibit, and therefore no audience would see. Interestingly, however, because of its B-film format and its relatively simple conventions, horror film was certainly the most commercially vital category of feature film production in the 1970s and 80s, even as it was being denounced from virtually all respectable standpoints as cheap, unworthy, gross, embarrassing, all of the criticisms that are generally leveled against horror film as low art. But what it did do, this capital cost allowance and its propensity for the production of horror films, it actually spawned the career of celebrated Canadian director David Cronenberg. His more recent fare includes things like Maps to the Stars, Cosmopolis. He's probably most famous for his 1983 remake of The Fly. And he became a Hollywood director, but he maintained his Canadian roots. In fact, every film that he's ever made, including his more recent Hollywood productions, has been filmed in Toronto. And interestingly enough, while it did spawn that, as well as some other Canadian hits like the movie Meatballs and the celebrated Canadian adaptation The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz. In 1982, the capital cost allowance was reduced to 50%, and the era of high production, although it had no exhibition really, came to a close. And what followed has come to be called the Toronto New Wave, which existed in Canadian film production history from the early 1980s through to the 1990s. It was really part of the national film and video policy that was enacted by the Canadian government in 1984. So the Canadian Film Development Corporation, which was really a production side government funding institution, it was transformed into Telefilm Canada in 1983. Recognizing that television was probably the most viable media format for the distribution of Canadian film. And this transformation came with it a 35 million Canadian dollar broadcast program development fund to reflect its new dual orientation, funding television programs as well as theatrical feature films. So from the early 1980s into the late 1990s, a generation of incredibly talented independent filmmakers began to emerge in Toronto, further aided by the introduction in the mid-1980s of these various provincial funding agencies. And these films, more than social realism and the sort of natural mythic Canadian landscape, were much more concerned with the social relations of urban alienation. And in 1984, amongst these funding institutions was also the Perspective Canada program out of the Toronto International Film Festival. And I'll come back to the establishment of Canadian film festivals a little bit later in this video lecture. And the Perspective Canada program was the world's largest international platform for Canadian cinema. Also in the mid-1980s, in 1986, was the creation of the Ontario Film Development Corporation. And in 1988, Norman Jewison, who had been an earlier generation Canadian film producer, founded the Canadian Film Centre, the CFC, also in Toronto. And these new government-funded initiatives worked to foster this group of director auteurs in their cumulative bid to sort of rejuvenate the Canadian film industry. For example, Vincenzo Natali's Cube, produced in 1997, which was an astonishingly simple and yet just as terrifying ConocoVision sci-fi horror hybrid. It was produced through the CFC's feature film project, and it broke box office records for Canadian film in Japan, and it actually grossed $15 million in France. So while most Canadians were largely unaware of it at the time, it was certainly internationally popular. And Natali was, of course, a member of this group that came to be dubbed the Toronto New Wave, which came to the fore largely in the late 1980s, and it consisted of some 20 Canadian filmmakers, including names that you may or may not have heard of: Bruce McDonald, Don McKellar, Adipa Mehta, Atta Magoyan, John Grayson, Jeremy Podeswa, Tom Fitzgerald, Patricia Rotsema, and Bruce LaBruce, most of whom studied film and began their careers within the Toronto cinematic infrastructure, often at Ryerson or U of T. And a new standard of urban representation was established by Patricia Rotsema's portrayal of urban alienation in Toronto with her I've Heard the Mermaids Singing, which was released in 1987, had huge international appeal, and debuted at the 1987 Toronto International Film Festival. And Canadian film historian Paul Salmon, he actually describes the Toronto New Wave in terms that were clearly appropriated from the French New Wave, or the French Nouvelle Vague from the 1960s, and characterizes the Toronto New Wave aesthetic as one in which there's a rejection, or at least a deep questioning of entrenched tradition, an openness to experiment in terms of narrative structures and subject matter, and a willingness to embrace collaboration and artistic versatility. And certainly this group of Toronto New Wave filmmakers, there were cliques amongst them, but they were largely collaborative. Most of them listed in that list, the brief list I gave of the 20, have worked together. Very few of them have not crossed paths, at least personally, if not professionally. And even though directors like Deepa Mehta and Bruce McDonald, Leah Poole, Atta Magoyan, Francois Girard, Denis Villeneuve, Sarah Polley, Mina Shum, Denis Arcand, Jean-Marc Vallée, and Javier Dolan, names that I'll invite you to look up on Wikipedia or through Google, they've given renewed vigor to Canadian feature filmmaking since the early 1980s. Domestic films have averaged only between 2 and 6% of box office revenues in Canada, and less than 5% of screen time in traditional Canadian cinema theaters. In a sense, our own domestic cinema is foreign to Canadian audiences, so much so that in the era of the big box rental agencies like Blockbuster, to find a Canadian film, they were usually located in the foreign film section of their genre organization of their stores, because the broader population of films available was, of course, traditional Hollywood cinema. And so at this point, it's time to advance now to slide number 7 in the accompanying PowerPoint presentation to this video lecture. So given the long-standing difficulty that Canadian-made feature films have had in penetrating Canadian movie theaters, as it happens, television has been their most reliable means of distribution. Jeanette Sloniowski, we learned from our textbook on page 108, in her book, Canadian Communications, Issues in Contemporary Media and Culture, she sums up the plight of Canadian movies as follows. Canadian movies not coming to the cinema near you. And because of this, television is really often the only outlet for the viewing and distribution of Canadian films. The Canadian Film and Television Production Association, the CFTPA, announced that more than 40% of revenue earned by Canadian movies, on average, comes from contemporary pay television. And in addition to television, another venue through which Canadian cinema has found an audience and international acclaim even is in the rising tradition of international film festivals over the last 25 years. And it's not coincidental that this rise of Canadian cinema in the last 30 years emerges with the founding of 2 of Canada's top film festivals. The Montreal World Film Festival was established in 1975, and the Toronto Festival of Festivals, now renamed the Toronto International Film Festival, was initiated in 1976. And following the success of these festival venues for the exhibition of Canadian films, was the establishment of the Vancouver International Film Festival in 1982, and the Atlantic Film Festival, held in Halifax in the Maritimes in 1980. And it might be trite but true that if part of the process of canonization of Canadian films requires attention from critics, it's these film festivals that are the prime vehicle for English, Canadian, and Quebecois cinema to garner this kind of attention. An interesting case study in this regard is Toronto New Wave director Deepa Mehta, who is a Canadian Indian citizen. And if you remember our lecture about the Canadian music industry, when Bryan Adams' hit song for the movie Robin Hood called Everything I Do was not considered CanCon, originally not considered CanCon, Canadian Content for Radio play, because it had been co-written with a British author. Similarly, in 1996, the Perspective Canada series at the Toronto International Film Festival, it opened with Deepa Mehta's Fire. And what's interesting is that Telefilm Canada initially hesitated funding the distribution of Fire because it didn't fulfill the requirements to be deemed a Canadian film. For Telefilm Canada's purposes, a film's Canadianness is evaluated on a point system according to the nationality of talent and craftspeople involved with the film. And because of the joint Indian production of the film, it just wasn't Canadian enough. Fortunately, the Perspective Canada program at TIFF has no point system, and so Fire, it was decided, was a Canadian production. It's interesting. What's available in the UFV library as a streaming video is a short NFB production called Deepa Mehta in Profile. It's only about 25 minutes long, and if you're interested in this Indian Canadian identity and her significant award-winning film production history, it's a great little documentary video to look at. Probably the most successful, if not the most celebrated, auteur director out of the Toronto New Wave. Pictured here is Atom Egoyan, also an international identity that he foregrounds in many of his films, like Deepa Mehta. And our film scholar, Canadian film scholar, Liz Chach, sees fit to quote him at length in one of her many articles. Egoyan says that while it may sound perverse, we, as in the Toronto New Wave collaborators and directors, we benefit from not having a strong internal market. We don't compete with each other over box office share, over gigantic fees, or star treatment, because it's simply not an issue. And he says that this is both a blessing and a curse. As artists, it means that our survival is not set by public taste, but by the opinion of our peers. And he suggests that peers really is the festival programmers, the most influential of which is the Toronto International Film Festival. And building on French cultural theorist Pierre Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital as opposed to financial capital, Liz Chach, she employs the term critical capital to refer to the value that a film accrues in Canada through its success in the festival circuit. Unlike the rest of the year, when little critical or popular support seems to be mustered for Canadian films at all, festivals generate crucial critical, public, and industry interest in Canadian films. For example, the vast majority of the screenings of Canadian films at the 2003 edition of the Toronto International Film Festival were actually sold out. And American film critic Roger Ebert suggests that these film festivals, particularly the Toronto International Film Festival, is one in which you may make a film in the low-budget environment of Canadian film production, only to have it find significant success at TIFF, and therefore it'll become a box office hit around the world. So at this point, I'll encourage you to proceed to slide 8, the last slide in the PowerPoint presentation that accompanies this lecture video, as we conclude our examination of the Canadian cultural industry in mass media of cinema in the 21st century. So, under the conditions of digitalization and the internet and the World Wide Web, which I'll discuss in a little bit more detail in our next and final lecture. In the new millennium, Canadian cinema has become, as much international cinema has, really international collaboration, cross-border collaborations, particularly with the United States, but really all around the world. Now, not to say there hasn't been Canadian films still under the nationalist umbrella. There was some interesting ones out of the Canadian Midwest right around the turn of the millennium, including Gary Burns' Way Downtown from 2000 and award-winning filmmaker Guy Madden's My Winnipeg from around the same time. Both of those filmmakers actually have a significant canon of films, very nationalist, very Canadian, very Midwestern in their own right. But the new millennium is really characterized by the establishment of these cross-border collaborations, these international collaborations. And these actually echo the footprint of one of many committees convened by the Canadian government over the 20th century. The footprint of what's called the Applebaum-Hebert Committee, which existed in 1981 and 1982. And unlike the previous committees, all of which were concerned with American imperialism, media imperialism, especially in Canada and the Canadian cinema industry, conspicuously absent from the early 1980s Applebaum-Hebert Committee report was the anti-commercial and anti-American rhetoric of the previous commission reports. And certainly we see such over-the-top, that is internet and not governed by Canadian institutions like the CRTC, vehicles like Netflix, which stream through the internet rather than through traditional broadcast vehicles, has given rise to a huge collaboration. One of the series that's popular on Netflix, a television series, is called Schitt's Creek, which features Canadian film actors from the SCTV era of television that we looked at in a previous lecture. Also popular in the new millennium was a range of big hit films, actually, which were these international co-productions. And amongst these was My Big Fat Greek Wedding from 2002, Resident Evil 2, through all of the actual Resident Evil movies. Resident Evil 2 was 2004, but these are all international co-productions in which Canada participated. There was Ginger Snaps in 2000, a very Canadian-oriented werewolf movie. Dawn of the Dead in 2004 was a remake of a George A. Romero zombie film with significant Canadian interests. Cosmopolis by David Cronenberg in 2012. The super blockbuster Passchendaele with Canadian superstar Paul Gross was released in 2008. And actually, surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly, one of the highest grossing Canadian international co-productions of all time was the feature film Trailer Park Boys, released in 2006. And so to conclude this two-class lecture discussion of the Canadian film industry, I'd just like to point out that the Hollywood studios, the vertical integration of Hollywood studios that occurred in the early 20th century that we looked at in our last lecture, all the way, this vertical integration, of course, was broken to some degree with the antitrust laws in the United States in the mid-20th century, but all the way through until the earliest years of the new millennium, this American domination of Canadian theatrical venues for cinema maintained. The same companies that owned major Hollywood studios also owned Canada's principal theater chains. Now today, Cineplex Entertainment is Canada's only significant chain. It has 163 theaters and over 1,600 screens across the country. And the company purchased the 24 theaters belonging to Canada's second largest chain, Empire Theatres, in 2013 in order to have that number, while AMC Entertainment Inc. Has been divesting its international holdings to focus on the American market. In Canada, provincial governments, most notably in Quebec, Ontario, and here in BC, have instituted programs to encourage Hollywood producers to locate their film and television productions in such places as Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And Vancouver has even adopted the moniker Hollywood North for its deep dependence in its cinema production industry on Hollywood financial interests within the city. And these foreign location service productions accounted for $1.74 billion in spending in the 2012-13 year that I've harvested many statistics from for this lecture. Close to two-thirds of that production, so close to 70% of that production right here in British Columbia. And I was going to actually screen at the end of this lecture in class, if we had had that opportunity, Bruce McDonald's film Highway 61 from 1991, which is actually very much about the relationship that Canadian film industry has with the U.S. entertainment industry, including music as well as television and cinema. But unfortunately, there's no access to a streaming service. I looked quite vigorously and couldn't find any access to that film through a streaming service that we could use in lieu of face-to-face instruction for our course. So the fact that we're unable to do that, I'm going to require the screening of MacDonald's other film from the era, his earlier Roadkill, which actually has the same two major stars in it, from 1989. And this film is available on Canopy through the UFV library. And it will be required reading, as in there is likely to be questions on the final quiz that are about this film. And so it'll be necessary for you to access the UFV library, access the Canopy distribution, the Canopy holdings of films that's available through the UFV library, and to screen Bruce MacDonald's film Roadkill from 1989. So I'll leave you with that, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So I'll conclude the lecture, our second last lecture in the course, and I'll hope everyone remains healthy and safe, and we will continue and conclude the course in our next brief lecture on the Canadian cultural industries that emerged through the internet in our next class. Until then, have a great week and enjoy the viewing.